For ages now, the idea that humans only use a portion of their total brain capacities has been presented to the public via intense movie thrillers such as the 2011 film Limitless and the more recent Lucy, in which the idea is presented to us through Morgan Freeman's heavenly tone. And let's be realistic, if Morgan Freeman tells you that you only use 10% of your brain, you pretty much have to believe it. After all, it's Morgan Freeman. Anyways, the idea is preposterous by all means. The idea that our brain's total potential is 10 times greater than what we actually use is pure pseudoscience, and many studies have been done to disprove the concept. In a recent Johns Hopkins University report, the myth is debunked. The team at Hub, which is a JHU newspaper type of thing, got an interview with a Dr. Barry Gordon of the School of Medicine, where he is a professor of neurology, and he is also a professor of cognitive science at the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. In their interview with him, he explained that the brain is always in constant use. As a matter of fact, the brain is almost entirely in constant use. That is, the brain in its entirety is almost always working at about 100%. More so, Gordon goes on to say, let's put it this way, the brain represents 3% of the body's total weight and uses 20% of the body's energy. This comparison is meant to show that the brain is about 1/33 of our total weight, yet consumes about a fifth of our energy. It's like a common man's proof that the brain is always using its total capacity, and therefore debunking the myth in a way that the average citizen could completely understand with ease. The actual explanation is much lengthier and much more scientific, but the gist of it is that we can prove using brain scans and several other tests that brain activity is almost always constant in about 100% of the brain. Of course, there's scenarios in which the brain doesn't need to use its full 100%, but even then the percentages are much higher than the 10% that most people believe.
While nobody knows where this myth originally began, it's been repeated through various mediums for most of the 20th century, right around the time that neuroimaging technology entered the medical field. These methods, however, were generally unsafe and unreliable, which left a lot of room for dubious claims to be made about such a complex organ. Reliable MRI, CT, and CET imaging were not developed until the 1970s and 1980s and later, long after false information from bad or simply fabricated research had had time to permeate Western culture. Many people familiar with this myth recognize it as a 10% myth, but in reality there have been many different numbers mentioned, often presented as a range, like 10 to 20%. Other details of the myth have also taken different forms. Some versions state that the remaining percentage is truly untapped. Some say that the amount used is indicative of intelligence, while others vaguely attribute that remaining percentage to the subconscious mind, a convenient, ambiguous term for the portion of mental capacity that only psychics were said to have the ability to utilize. Psychics and others claiming to have supernatural mental powers were instrumental in the perpetuation of this myth, especially with the advent of the television psychics of the late 20th century and beyond. Uri Geller himself even referenced it in one of his books. The ambiguity and convenience of this untapped mental power idea has also made it an attractive movie plot point, one that's remained common even today with the films that were previously mentioned.
In each of the following slides, we will present two graphs. The one on the left contains data from every survey response collected, and the one on the right is an adjusted data set, which has been changed to exclude a potentially biased sample of students coming out of an anatomy class, who all answered every single question correctly, an anomaly not seen in any other group of responses collected.
The most important question we asked in our surveys was about how much of their brain matter do most people use. The responses were presented as multiple choice. The choices were 5%, 10%, 60%, and 100%. In both the unadjusted and adjusted graphs, you can see that the vast majority of respondents, 36% and 43% respectively, said that about 60% of their brain is used by most people. This was an unexpected result to us because going into this, we expected that most people would say about 10%, since that's the most common way that we've seen the myths reported. However, in researching the myth itself, we realized that the only thing that every single version has in common is the idea that humans don't use 100% of their brain. So this 60% number may be a rationalization by most people given additional knowledge that's permeated popular culture regarding our brain, what sections of our brain are used for which tasks, and things like that. We also asked respondents if there are people who use more than this average amount that they had already told us in the previous question. The reason that we asked this was to gauge the prevalence of the belief that psychics, or people of above average intelligence, access more of their brains than an average person, and that's what gives them their abilities. The vast majority of respondents said yes, there are people who use more than the average percentage of brain matter. In the adjusted statistic, this number of people who said yes is actually higher, because in the unadjusted one, where we had those additional 100% responses, people said that there weren't people who used more than 100% because using more than 100% would be illogical. So including that part of the sample gives a somewhat less realistic picture of how prevalent this belief is. In order to further understand the belief that there are people who use more than the average amount of brain matter, we asked whether the percentage of brain matter used is indicative of a person's intelligence. The majority of the respondents said no, both in our unadjusted and adjusted graphs. This is interesting to us as researchers because we expected that more people would believe in people of above average intelligence than they would in people who were psychic or possessed supernatural powers. We didn't ask explicitly what using a greater percentage of your brain meant, but we can assume that it has something to do with psychic or supernatural powers, because this is the only other possibility that's presented by the myth in most of its forms. Finally, we asked respondents what percentage of their own brain matter do they think that they use. From this unadjusted graph, it might appear that most people said that they use about 100% of their brains, but it's important to remember that this 100% bar compared to the height of all the other bars combined is still relatively small. Only about 28% of people said that they use 100% of their brain. In the adjusted graph, where we remove the responses from the 4 anatomy students who got everything right, this paints a much more accurate picture, where most respondents said that they use either 10% or 75% of their brain. This was much closer to what we expected as researchers because that 10% number was what we see most commonly perpetuated. The 75% number was not something that we expected, and we believe that it paints an interesting picture of how people perceive themselves compared to the average person. In examining how people rated themselves compared to the average brain matter usage, we found that 16% of people rate themselves as using less brain matter than the average individual. 32% rate themselves as using more, and 52% rated themselves at exactly average. Since most 100% respondents felt that they used 100%, which was the average that they had said, adjusting this to remove the 100% answers provided by the 4 anatomy students, we get 19% feeling that they use less than average brain matter, 38% feeling that they use more, and 43% feeling that they use the average amount. It's important to remember that rating oneself as higher or lower doesn't necessarily mean smarter or less smart, because the way that we asked this in our survey was simply how much people use compared to the average person. And some people seem to feel that amount of brain matter used was not indicative of how intelligent you are, but indicated other things, or was completely arbitrary. However, we as researchers feel that this is an indication of how people compare their intelligence to the average person, because we figured that the average person would not consider other people around them more psychic or supernaturally gifted than themselves.
One more interesting point to note is that some of the responses we received had answers that conflicted in some way, such as saying that people use 100% of their brain matter, but that there might also be people who use more than that. These illogical answers were disproportionately present in responses where people got the fundamental percentage questions correct, a group that we expected to be more educated overall.